Well, welcome to the Suncoast In-Depth Podcast. I'm Brett Watson. This is Ricardo Aviles. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
It's always fun. So this is chapter 15 in the Universal Christ, the two witnesses to Jesus and Christ.
Yeah.
So you and I were talking a little bit about things that stood out in here. Why don't you tell us as a group what you appreciated about this chapter?
Well, there's a couple things. One, I just never have spent very much time thinking about. I knew Paul never met Jesus, or at least to our understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So it was definitely interesting to hear like two different perspectives, and I appreciated that. You know, he goes from Mary knowing Jesus as a man, and then Paul knowing Jesus as the Christ. And growing up, that's always been, those two things have always been together. Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And so it was nice to see a perspective of the human that Mary knew and the Christ, this, with Paul having this mystical experience, and having that 3 days of blindness and almost like this, after he meets Christ,
mm-hmm.
and this transformation that happened,
mm-hmm.
And just the different way he lays out Jesus more so than the perspective of Mary in the Gospels.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it. I mean, it's a great chapter.
Yeah, they come from two different starting points.
Yeah, exactly.
In their understanding of Jesus the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that, well, one of the questions I can think coming up from this perspective, or the distinction that Rohr makes between Jesus the Christ and the universal Christ,
right,
is, well, then how was Paul, or how are we able to connect with the Christ the way that Mary was able to?
It's really difficult, right?
Yeah, it's different.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's difficult. I think it requires a change in perspective.
But I think for at least for us, and Paul obviously lived a lot closer to Christ,
It is difficult. Anyway, go ahead.
It's difficult to truly understand the man that Jesus was, because he has become such a deity in our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I always
we
say
only have these limited records.
100%,
Yeah.
right? I always say, everybody needs a North Star, and this idea of the life that Jesus lived. Outside of whether or not he was a deity, he seemed to be tapped into that Christ spirit, that universal Christ spirit that we talk to fully. And so it is hard to truly connect with something that you truly see as perfect. So it's like this mountaintop that we're trying to constantly reach, and we make a little bit of progress, and then we mess up, we fall a little bit down the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
But
Which has its upside.
100%.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying this as a bad thing.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to have a North Star,
Mm-hmm.
and a pinnacle, something that is, in your mind, you'll never fully reach.
Yeah.
But you try your best to reach it. And even if you fall short, you're living a better life.
Mm-hmm.
And just that North Star mentality, I think, is really good. And I think that's where, because we didn't know Jesus as a man, I don't think that we have much record of whether or not Jesus actually did fail at his message sometimes. Maybe he didn't fully live up to everything that he claimed to want or strive for. But I think what we do have is this Christ spirit and the stories that we do have of Jesus, and showing these are the ideals.
Yeah.
And we will fail at those ideals. We won't live up to them fully.
Yeah.
But we can at least try our best.
So you think that it's tougher for us to connect to the humanity of Jesus?
I'm speaking for myself. I mean, it is difficult.
I think that's true for most people. I think most people would agree with you. And even while I was coming at you for that, I realized, no, wait a minute, he's right.
Yeah.
It is more difficult. But it's more difficult in the sense that you brought up, that we don't know Jesus of Nazareth.
Mm-mm.
We only know a little tiny bit about him through the eyes of these guys that wrote down these stories.
Right.
Clearly idealistic stories,
Right.
whether true 100% or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of that has value for why you said. But one of the ways that we can know the humanity is, I think, helped by what Rohr's perspective on the universal Christ, right? Yeah. Because as I am sitting here talking to you, I am talking to the Christ, but I'm also talking to Ricardo.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we do come to know humanity through humanity.
Yeah.
You know?
And it sounds almost heretical to say that, but it's like Jesus said that.
He did.
You know?
That's the funny thing about those who fling the word heresy around. Usually it's because they just don't see what the text that they're holding up on Pinnacle actually says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love that. And one of the things I didn't realize, just going, like, if we take it from Mary's perspective, one of the things he says in here was, by the way, prostitution is never mentioned as one of her demons in any account. I suspect sex is our demon, and we projected it onto her.
Yeah.
That was something new that I did not know. I mean, I always just heard growing up, like, she was a prostitute and, you know.
I forget which century and which, I think it was a pope actually that took that position. And if I'm not mistaken, a beloved pope. And so it stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe she was, but the text doesn't pin that on her. There's nothing directly in the text to say that she was a prostitute. 7 demons, yeah, but not a prostitute. So
no, it was interesting. I just think seeing this perspective, you know, Mary was the first person to see Jesus after resurrection, which kind of, in my mind, sealed the deal on if there was ever a question. But it was interesting because she was like, 100%, this is Jesus.
Yeah.
And even the apostles were like, I don't know. I really need to see for myself, you know. And which apostle was it that said, I want to touch the... Thomas, that wanted to touch his hands and all that kind of stuff. It's like,
unless I can place my hand in his wounds, I won't believe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So even
Thomas.
with, you know, this is why I'm saying this is difficult, right? Mm-hmm. Because even the men and women that were with him, more mainly the men, still needed proof of Christ's or Jesus's next level of connectiveness to God. Mm-hmm. These are the people that witnessed everything that he had done through in all his work throughout his life, and they're still doubting. So when the church says, have no doubt, you know, don't question or don't wrestle with uncertainty.
Very inconsistent with the text.
The apostles needed visual proof that Jesus not only raised from the dead, but they needed to be able to poke the wounds.
Yeah.
So how the heck are we supposed to have
not
zero doubt and zero uncertainty?
Think about how bold they were when they wrote down these things, okay?
100%.
They admitted freely that most of the post-resurrection accounts, right, so after he's raised, they don't recognize him at first. What's up with that? And I love Rohr's explanation for that.
Yeah.
That what they're connecting with is, yes, he thinks anyway, that yes, this is Jesus, resurrected, Jesus the Christ, but it's more of, I guess you could say, the universal Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is something that they don't recognize about him after the resurrection.
Yeah.
So then Paul comes along. He never knew the man Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ. He only has his mystical experience, as you mentioned, and gets to know him from a totally different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more like us.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And I try to be really careful how I say this because of like not wanting to be heretical by any means. I'm just having a conversation with a friend. It is very interesting to hear a story like the resurrection. Mm-hmm. Jesus as the man goes through the suffering, dies, and then 3 days later is resurrected into something new. Mm-hmm. So much so new that his own friends didn't recognize him at first.
Yeah.
Paul, the same thing. Paul goes through this suffering and and I know these are symbolic, mm-hmm. but 3 days later and transforms into something new. Mm-hmm. I think that's an outline for us, right?
For sure.
You know what I'm saying? Like for death and resurrection to happen. There's this almost like this time frame. There's a death of something that needs to happen in our mm-hmm. lives, whether it's our paradigm, whether it's relationships, whether it's the way we're living. There has to be a death to those things for true resurrection to happen and change to truly happen. Mm-hmm. And I think the beauty of that is that there is a parallel to Christ, to Jesus's life, and Paul in this 3-day resurrection and transformation. I think that's really beautiful. Yeah. And I don't think it's by accident, right? Like so many people that read the Bible at face value, whether it be like this has to be historically true, are missing so much of the beautiful undertones in the narrative.
Oh yeah.
This is so symbolic. There's so much symbolism throughout the Bible. And
Jonah.
I think 3 days.
He's got a whole attitude change when he's spit up on the beach.
And to act like that's really
3 days in the whale.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like there's this transformative thing that happens within those 3 days. Yeah. And I don't think that's by accident. And it makes the text so much more beautiful and interesting when you read it that way and understand maybe that 3-day period is the transformation that we all need.
I think that the number 3 isn't something that we have to take any more than symbolically. I don't. Mm-hmm. I think it signifies that there is a process that takes place.
Yeah.
And in a kind of liminal space that exists in that process, mm-hmm. right? So that 3 days is that liminal space mm-hmm. where you're kind of in limbo. You just, oh God, what's happening to me? Mm-hmm. But when you think about it, the life, then death, then resurrection pattern, it's just all over the place, mm-hmm. right? These are powerful symbolic stories. And, historically, I think Paul really did have this mystical experience and mm-hmm. and maybe it was a literal 3 days. Who knows? But it doesn't really matter. There's a transitional period that is uncomfortable and mm-hmm. kind of, what's the word I'm thinking of? There's a lot of ambiguity during that time and wondering, So I get very concerned when I talk with people who I feel like have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We've talked about that before. And have to remind myself that, look, it's part of that. It's part of the process. And they may be in this liminal space and I know how difficult that is. And so I can empathize with that. And then I know that they don't have to be in that liminal space, but maybe they do, Brett.
Yeah.
Maybe they do.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing to remember because you want to see people be passionate again for righter reasons than they maybe were before.
Yeah.
But I think that whole process is just necessary.
Yeah.
So we have to approach it from the same angle as Paul. That's inevitable because we weren't there.
Yeah.
But I think it helps to know that, getting back to this, I think it helps to not necessarily know, but to attach to this notion of the universal Christ being even in the people that are in our regular day lives, mm-hmm. even in people like Stephen. Yeah. But it's important, right? It's important on so many levels.
Yeah.
I can know something of God by knowing you. You can know something new about God by knowing me.
Yeah.
And then from there, I can value you in ways that I couldn't value you before,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. So it's a really important, and I think it's interesting too that this is obviously the way things had to go, because Jesus of Nazareth wasn't going to be around forever, being fully human.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see the limits that it places on a person's development when there's a hyper focus on what Larry described as seeing Jesus, the God-man, worshiping Jesus, the God-man. He even motioned like this when he was preaching Sunday, instead of attaching more to the humanity and Christ in humanity, and being out like this,
Yeah.
and serving, right?
Right.
Loving others. It really is something that I think is changing and needs to change in the church. Definitely see that happening here,
Yeah. 100%.
and I'm sure in many other churches. We're kind of in our bubble here, but I'm sure that this is happening. I really think that there's a leap in consciousness overall, despite the media's efforts to quell it. It seems
Yeah. There's a lot of profit in people fighting. So.
there really is.
But I wanted to ask, you're one of our resident theologians. So for us lay people, Paul, when did Paul write his letters? Do we have like a roundabout idea?
He died around 64. His letters, some of his letters are the earliest writings. Probably they all were written before the Gospels, actually.
So that was my next question. Why does Paul write so differently about Jesus than the Gospels? Because from a lot of people assume that the Gospels were written by the actual apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, which we don't know.
Yeah.
But we do know roundabout time frames, which I believe is Mark, the earliest one.
Yeah, many scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel written down. Obviously, the stories were circulating before that.
So it was more of like the oral history and recounts of Jesus's life, and then the gospel writers came together or put those stories together.
Yeah,
and obviously combining a lot of symbolism, and I can't remember which gospel it is that parallels Jesus's life with David or Moses.
David would be Matthew. Yeah.
So there was purpose behind, but it does seem to be more of an eyewitness account to Jesus's life. And Paul writing in a way that it's not an eyewitness account, but more of his own experience. Even though he technically lived closer to Christ, his stories, his letters were written down closer to Christ's life than the Gospels.
Yeah, I mean, this is just conjecture, but I think what happened is Paul was a smart dude. He was a thinker, and he realized something about Jesus the Christ and wanted to get those ideas out. He had his mystical experience too, and so there was this personal experience that he had that radically changed his attitude toward Christ and the church, right? Went from being a persecutor of the church to a communicator about it. And so he took those ideas and he made sure that he got them down and moved around.
Yeah.
One of the major ideals was he saw that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the God of the Gentiles too, and that the distinction that was made between Jew and Gentile was largely misunderstood by his day, by the religious thinkers. of his day, and had been turned into a tribalistic thing beyond what it was meant to be.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to get those ideas out. He calls it the mystery that had been hidden for ages, that there is no Jew or Gentile, barbarian, Scythian, there is no male or female in Christ.
Yeah.
Radical stuff. He definitely saw this universal Christ connecting all things, and wanted to get that out. Probably it was more than they could hear in his day. It seems that it was, given the history of the church.
Yeah.
But it is coming into its fullness, I think, in our day. So we're kind of lucky to live now.
100% agree. What happened to Paul?
He was,
Excuse me.
he was likely beheaded, as the tradition goes, under Nero, I believe.
Okay, because I mean,
around
considering
64.
his work and what he was doing, it seems like he would have been
he
killed.
was a dangerous dude.
Yeah.
In their eyes, yeah.
One last thing that I wanted to bring up that I thought was really interesting, I highlighted it. This is in regards to Paul. In his groundbreaking study, the Apostle Paul in the Introspective Conscience of the West, the renowned Harvard scholar and pastor Christopher Stedall wrote that Paul hardly ever speaks of personal guilt or personal and private salvation. We are just trained to hear him that way. He goes so far to say that it is undisputed 7 original letters of Paul. He does not speak of personal forgiveness as much as God's blanket forgiveness of all sin and evil. Sin, salvation, and forgiveness are always corporate, social, and historical concepts of the Jewish prophet and for Paul. When he recognizes this, it changes your entire readings of the gospel. So that inspired me to go back and actually read Paul's letters from that paradigm and perspective. And it's amazing when you have that paradigm shift and you just like, your lens is changed to another way of reading and understanding. Like, I don't blame people for reading the Bible with their certain paradigm or lens.
Yeah.
But that's why we always ask people gently, like, try reading it from this perspective and see what happens. Can you still come to the same conclusion if you're watching it from a different paradigm? And so I think that's one thing I'd encourage people to do.
Yes.
Read this chapter, then go read Paul's letters and see what happens. See what paradigm shifts for you.
This is what's so important. So what you're describing there could be called, in the older church, Lectio Divina. So you got this lens, and all of a sudden you went back to the text and you kind of like focused on it, right?
Yeah.
It's just a form of meditation.
Yeah.
That's all that is. But I'm saying this because of how important what he calls in the book orthopraxy is, right? The right practice. It's important for us to not just read the Bible looking for what we want to see, but to really try to be open and objective as we read it. So much more value can be derived from it. Yes, study, which involves context, understanding some of the history and so on, that's all important stuff for sure. It is. Even word studies, dare I say it. But, God, that stuff gets abused all the time. But it does have some benefit to it. But just when you go through something, you go through like a death and a resurrection, and that's really where you're gaining that lens from, right?
Right.
It's important then to go and kind of reread these things, remeditate on them, contemplate them. Yeah.
I mean, because we do that even with like movies and stuff like that. We watch
Absolutely.
a movie once and then we wait a year and we watch it again and we're like, oh, I didn't catch that at all. Like, you're whether it's a detail that you missed or a paradigm, your lens has changed. There's always some like symbolism that you miss out on or something that's in there and that's a movie.
I'd be embarrassed to tell you how many times I watched the first 2 seasons of Ted Lasso.
Oh, don't be embarrassed. We're rewatching it right now.
We are too,
because the new season's coming out.
out. Yeah. And if you can gain, I mean, there's no way to watch that once and get all the little murmurs and stuff.
He has all these little
nuances.
one-liners.
Yeah. But if that's true for a sitcom, imagine in something as multi-layered as the scriptures. You know, there's
One
a
of my
lot
favorite lines that he says in season 1, he said it's, the lady that owns the soccer club he was coming out, he was really late. And she's like, "Oh, burning the midnight oil, I see." And he's like, it's like the great philosopher said, it seems like the harder I work, the luckier I get. I'm like, that's a great line.
It is.
That is a great line. And I didn't catch that the first time. The harder I work, the luckier I get. And I think that's so true in life.
Yeah.
But he's just full of them. And you talk about a pure character.
Yes.
An ideal character.
Yeah.
Somebody that just, there's this underlying tragedy that's happening in his life, and no matter what, he brings so much joy to people.
Right.
And that's an ideal that I hope that we can all live up to, like no matter what. I mean, he's going through this terrible divorce and this tragedy. He's losing the woman that he loves. His family's falling apart. And even in spite of all that, he still goes to the person that everybody ignores, everybody beats down, and loves on them and treats them like a human, and it changes their life. If that's not an ideal, I don't know what is.
And he's even betrayed by one that he did that for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're saying Ted Lasso is Jesus?
I'm saying, and I have said from the beginning, so this is a plug for Ted Lasso, and we thank Apple TV for sponsoring this video. No, but it's the gospel with F-bombs.
Yeah.
And before some of you more conservative buddies of mine say, I can't watch it, there's so much cussing in it.
Yeah.
Come on, man.
Yeah.
Just watch it. It is the gospel.
Now I'm going to have to watch it with that lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do it, man. You'll see it.
That's awesome.
It's fantastic. So, yeah. All right. Again, great stuff. Gaining the perspective of both of these witnesses is an important endeavor. Yes, the universal Christ, and through that, because we have to come at it from that perspective, through that, seeing the humanity of the Christ through each other.
Amazing stuff, man.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.